I think it comes from the reverse of what you were saying. You were saying, has FDA ever done these drugs? If they have done them, they might think differently. I have done these drugs. And I am convinced, not just from my own experience, but I hear stories almost every day from people that found tremendous healing from MDMA or from psilocybin or from 5-MeO-DMT or from other psychedelics. I am constantly hearing MDMA healing stories of things that were actually remarkable. So I just heard the other day about a therapy. This was an underground therapy session, and this was husband and wife, and they're in their 60s, they're old. And then under the influence of MDMA, the wife shared about how she had been sexually abused as a child, and she'd never shared it with anybody. And it really helped their relationship for her to be able to share that. So the optimism comes from not just my experience, not just the stories that I hear, but also from the data that we've gathered.
Welcome to Modern Enlightenment, a sanctuary for your soul, where we'll go on a path of personal and spiritual development. I'm Austin Mao.
And I'm Chuchu Wang. We are your companions on this journey of self-discovery and spiritual connection.
Join us as we delve into the fusion of modern psychotherapy, neuroscience, psychospirituality, and shamanic plant sacrament ceremonies, exploring the transformative potential of psychedelics for the mind, body, and spirit.
Our mission is to guide you to a place of profound awareness where emotions can be felt.
Together, let's illuminate the way to a brighter, more enlightened existence.
Modern Enlightenment, where your journey to inner peace begins.
All right, welcome to another episode of Modern Enlightenment. Super excited to introduce our guest who needs very little introduction in the field of psychedelics, Rick Doblin, the founder and president of MAPS, Harvard graduate, worked under Stanislav Grof, and self-proclaimed, what is it, Rick?
Fuck up who just keeps on trying. That's been the key. You know, you do things, you learn from them, you keep on going. That's the spirit.
Well, I thank whatever is out there, God, the divine, etc., for fuck-ups that keep on trying, like you, and I think like us too.
That's perseverance, the key. Incremental change, perseverance, and a vision of where you want to get to.
Yeah, beautiful.
Necessary for change makers.
Yeah, and resilience. You know, it took me a few days to be super depressed, what FDA did recently, blocking approval, requiring another phase 3 study. But once I kind of adjusted and figured out, okay, now here's the new reality. How do we make progress the best possible? I pivoted, and now I'm back into the happy mode of struggling to move the agenda forward.
Yeah, one thing I love about you is somehow there's so many rejections and delaying, and always discovering you find ways to process and be super optimistic and inspiring to people. Coping or moving through is such setback, and considering you've been working for this for decades.
Yeah, although I would say the setback is not so much for me, even though it is a setback for me. It's, 38 plus years at MAPS. But the real setback is for the PTSD patients who needed this treatment. For FDA to say, you need another phase 3 study that will delay things probably more than 2 years. Having their hopes that these treatments would be available for them are the real ones that are suffering from this FDA decision. And it's basically a decision that I don't think had to be. I think FDA could have chosen other options. Particularly what I thought is that they should have said that we've proven efficacy, but we have safety concerns. But it's pretty clear when you have 0.0001 statistical significance, 1 in 10,000, that it's random. This is on the efficacy results. And the second study was 1 in 2,500 that it was random. And then these are two considered to be independent studies, and you multiply those together. So it's basically 1 in 25 million chances that the results that we got were not from MDMA plus therapy, but were from some extraneous thing. So the FDA, I believe, should have said, if it was based on the science, should have said that efficacy was proven. Here's some of their safety concerns, and it would have been way less of a delay and an expense than 2+ years trying to figure out to do another phase 3 study.
I imagine receiving that news must have been so hard for you and for the team after working 38 years towards this.
But the part that was really difficult was that the decisions that were being made by the more traditional approach that Lycos was taking. For a long time, they said, oh, let's have a 6-month or so quiet period. We should have a quiet period before the FDA decides. And I'm like, well, these critics are not quiet. It didn't make sense. So both seeing successful responses to a lot of the critiques being fully made or made in a public setting, and to be constrained from speaking on our own at MAPS. Both MAPS and my communications were controlled by Lycos, because the story was I was on the Lycos board, and therefore anything I said would be interpreted as being from Lycos. Therefore, they had to monitor everything MAPS and I said. So communication approaches, transparency, things that I thought would be helpful that were not followed. But it's just been devastating for the investors in Lycos who've lost a lot of money. The patients are not getting access soon enough. The field, what I'm very concerned about is that the field of psychedelic assisted therapy, these hundreds of for-profit psychedelic companies and a few nonprofits, one of the messages that they may be getting, which is that when you combine psychedelics with psychotherapy, that's a problem for the FDA, because the FDA does not regulate therapy. So a lot of the, like Spravato, esketamine is approved by the FDA without therapy. And I think other companies are talking, like Mind Medicine talked about, oh, we give LSD without therapy, even though they had therapists and doctors there with the people the entire time. Compass is saying we're not doing therapy, we're just doing psychological support. And so I think that the wrong message could be drawn from what just happened at the FDA, that the way to go through FDA now is to do things without therapy, but with psychological support. Now, one of the things that people have thought about, so this question about would we do a study of just MDMA without therapy? That's kind of an interesting question. So one of the critiques of the phase 3 design, which was approved by the FDA, is that we could enroll people that had previously used MDMA. And so roughly 40% of the people had previously used MDMA. And then the critique was that, oh, these people are more favorably inclined to MDMA. So you've biased your sample because these people like MDMA, they want to do this, and therefore we can't trust your results. Even though FDA said ahead of time, yeah, you can bring in people that have done MDMA before. Now, the people that did, the 60% of the people that never did MDMA before responded the same as the 40% that had. So it really wasn't a biased situation. But the important point for the question here is that these people had done MDMA before and they still had PTSD. So this idea that, oh, you just give somebody a drug and you don't provide any support is inappropriate. So it's unethical, I think. If you take severe PTSD, these are people that have struggled for many, many years often, and the trauma is never really in the past, and you're in a situation where it feels overwhelming to them. They're really scared about feeling the feelings. They're linked to depression, to suicidality, to suicidal thoughts. Roughly 1/3 of the people in our study had what's called positive behaviors, which means they went beyond just thinking about suicide. So maybe they went to a hardware store and bought a rope, but they didn't use it. Or they went to a bridge and didn't jump over. But some positive behavior, so that people are struggling. And then just to say, oh, let's give them MDMA without any support feels destabilizing. We had suggestions that it might be interesting to do a study, just give people MDMA without any support. But Michael Mithoff, our lead psychiatrist, and myself and others thought it would be unethical to do that.
It almost feels like there's this whole new ball game now with this rejection. And a couple of days ago, you posted on Instagram and sent an email newsletter out saying that you were stepping down from the board of Lycos. And I remember a few months ago, you were at Ceremonia, and there was another fellow employee of MAPS, Chris, I think, that said, a lot of people think my job is to rein in Rick Doblin. And he said, my job is actually to unleash him.
He has done a lot of work on green energy. Renewable Choice was a company he started for wind farms. But he's very diplomatic, but he's also very practical. He helped start Students for a Sensible Drug Policy. So he's founders of that. So he's very drug policy oriented, politically oriented, as well as, very supportive of drug development, which is now much of which MAPS has turned over to Lycos. So this idea of unleashing me is something that music to my ears.
Now that you are, quote unquote, unleashed from Lycos, what do you want to tell the world? What do you want to be known? What's the path forward for you, for MAPS, for psychedelic therapy?
Yeah. First thing I think people need to know is that I believe that Lycos will succeed, that there's going to be this period of negotiation that they go through with FDA to figure out what exactly They want to do what kind of phase 3 studies, what kind of new information the FDA wants. I think that once those negotiations are over and then Lykos is ready to raise the funds and do the phase 3 study, whatever FDA wants, I believe they will work. And so I believe that this is a temporary major bump in the road, but it's in no way the end of MDMA-assisted therapy or the end of Lykos. So that's one of the things that's tricky, and Chuchu, you know about translating the treatment manual into Chinese, is that a lot of countries of the world look to the FDA as the premier regulatory agency, and they will follow the FDA. So we've been wanting to do research in Ukraine, therapy for all the people that are traumatized in Ukraine. But in Ukraine, you cannot do research with Schedule I drugs. And the same is true in Armenia. And there are other countries where we've been wanting to work, in Rwanda, in Kenya, South Africa, Jordan, all sorts of different places where we want to work. And they often look to the FDA to go first. So not only is this a setback for all the patients that have been waiting for this, but it's a real setback for many countries in the world where they were looking for the signal from the US. And I think China is one of those. So I think that as far as what I'm going to do next, what MAPS is going to do next, three things. So the main thing is, research, education, and advocacy. Those are the three main pillars of the nonprofit: research, public education, advocacy. So in research, what we're going to do is a lot of what Lykos is not going to do. So what I mean by that Lykos has narrowed itself to trying to get FDA approval and then trying to get insurance companies to cover it and then trying to build a business of MDMA-assisted therapy in the United States. Lykos has halted the early efforts that we had in Europe as a way to conserve funds, but also as a strategic choice that they would rather have put money into preparing for commercialization rather than expanding the research into Europe. And so one of the things that MAPS is going to do is work with a new nonprofit that we're helping to start that's going to be called something like MDMA Europe. And they're going to try to move forward. Lykos is not going to get to Europe for years to come. So there's been this Dutch Committee on MDMA, which was the Dutch equivalent of the FDA Advisory Committee. So the FDA Advisory Committee issued their report on June 4th, and that's where they said no way to approval. They do not recommend it. But 2 days later, the Dutch committee came out with their report. And now they had spent about a year on this. They had real subject matter experts. They were putting out a book-length report about their findings, and they came to the exact opposite conclusions of the FDA Advisory Committee. They said, yes, efficacy was proven. Yes, safety was proven. But since Lykos and no other company is trying to make MDMA into a medicine in the EMA or MHRA, which is the British equivalent of the FDA, but the Dutch committee said there's no effort to try to make MDMA into a medicine in Europe. So therefore, the Dutch government should immediately provide access for an unmet medical need for people that have not gotten sufficient help from the current available medicines and therapies for PTSD. They should do that in the form of what's called naturalistic studies, which is basically when sometimes people talk about research N of one, a number of one, where each person is their own experiment and you do a little bit of before and after, but you don't have control group. And so this idea is, it's like compassionate access. It's like what's happening in Australia, in Canada, Switzerland, this kind of access to psychedelics for more, basically compassionate use purposes. And so the Dutch government is now thinking that over and probably is going to endorse that. And so this MDMA Europe is going to go to EMA and MHRA and say, we would like to know if we bundle 100 people from around Europe or 150 people or 200 or 50 or whatever, is there some number of people that treated in naturalistic studies throughout Europe that we could bundle together into a phase 3 study? And would you indeed accept that? So that's going to be coming up. That's really exciting because if they do that, if EMA or MHRA accepts that and says, here's the number, then that means that we have the opportunity, if we do the fundraising, to develop MDMA into a potential treatment for PTSD with therapy in Europe, but to do it within a nonprofit context, do it completely open science, transparent, and then turn it into a generic. So that's one thing MAPS is working on in Europe. The other thing is global work, our global humanitarian projects. We're trying to work in Ukraine. So I just was in Warsaw and I'm going back to Warsaw for planning meetings to try to bring MDMA to Ukrainians, either refugees in Poland or Ukrainians traumatized still inside of Ukraine. We're working in Bosnia with survivors of the Srebrenica massacre from 30 years ago. Syrian refugees, second generation Syrian refugees in Denmark, we're trying to work with. Somaliland, we're trying to see if we can start some stuff in Africa, in Rwanda and other places. So MAPS is going to be doing that. Lycos is not going to be doing these global humanitarian projects at this time. MAPS is going to be doing this nonprofit approach in Europe. Then there's projects that are really important for scaling, but also for studying therapy, which is group therapy. One of the things that you developed at Ceremonia. So group therapy can be very helpful, particularly in the group integration and support process for each other. So MAPS, PSFC have done fundraising, MAPS Israel. So there's going to be 400 people receiving MDMA as part of a group therapy study in Israel. And so a couple of weeks ago, I convened a meeting with the group therapy research team in England that's going to do this at King's College. Also, Christopher, who's a psychiatrist at the Portland, Oregon VA, has just started group therapy. And then the Australian government is putting money for 200 people to go through group therapy that were traumatized from fires or floods. I can't remember, but from natural disasters. So I think group therapy. Then there's another thing which is particularly challenging from a regulatory point of view that MAPS is going to be working on, which is couples therapy. So couples is not a disorder, so it's not clear FDA would ever approve it, but there's nothing blocking them. But we want to be working with teams to study couples therapy. We're doing work trying to develop a protocol for conflict transformation with Israelis and Palestinians who small groups have done ayahuasca and MDMA together. And Lior Roseman at Essex now has done big studies with ayahuasca with Israelis and Palestinians. We're going to want to do that. Then still in this research bucket, next week or near the end of this week, we're filing a formal dispute with the FDA with lawyer science.
Yes.
It's great. And it's about our project. So MAPS has a $12.9 million grant from the state of Michigan to study cannabis in 320 veterans with PTSD. And it's been held up by FDA for 2 years now because they are refusing to let us study smoked marijuana. And they're refusing to let us study vaporized marijuana. And their entire critique of vaporized marijuana was against isolated cannabinoids in vape pens with different oils, that there are some safety issues. But we said, we didn't even say we're going to do this. It has nothing to do with our protocol, vape pens. We're using the packs, vaporizer, you put the bud in, you heat it up. There's no isolated cannabinoids. There's no oils, nothing like that. So we're launching this formal dispute with FDA with the same division of psychiatry that just rejected the Lycos's application. So what we're saying to the senior management of FDA and to this is that this group at the FDA, we feel, is not really sticking to the science when it comes to this kind of research. Now, a couple of years ago, we had another formal dispute against this particular division of psychiatry. This was about a protocol to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. And we had a previous one, 125 people, therapists have gone through that. And almost all of the people that worked on phase 3 had their own MDMA experiences, most of them in this protocol. And they said that it was very helpful for them as preparation for working with actual. So this kind of protocol, we tried to do it again in a simpler way. FDA said no. And they said, not only we're not going to give you permission for this, we'll never give you permission for this, but also your people were not qualified. They were not, you need an MD or a PhD for the lead person instead of a licensed master's therapist, and you need a doctor on site instead of a doctor on call. And we provided all sorts of reasons why that didn't make sense. And then after a while, we realized we had to launch a formal dispute. And in the end, we won on all those points. So I think what I'm trying to help people understand is that this division of psychiatry at FDA has in the past deviated from the science and has been overruled by senior management at FDA. So I know Lycos is going to try to negotiate with FDA. I wish them the best of success. And we are beyond this initial phase of negotiation and launching this formal dispute. The other thing MAPS is going to be doing that we would love to do, but this depends on whether we find the right donor, is we'd love to develop ibogaine, but ibogaine for opiate dependence, fentanyl dependence, but we'd like to do it in a way that I had hoped to do it with MDMA, meaning through donations in the public domain, fully transparent, and thinking about helping the ecosystem as well, and then turning it immediately into a generic. And we just
Mhm.
need 80 or $90 million over 5 to 7 years. That's it. So now there's even all these people that have been let go from Lycos. So the pool, the talent pool is there too. So we could do that. Okay, so that's more or less in the research bucket. Okay, then public education bucket, we're having the next Psychedelic Science 2025. That's going to be, I think,
Yay.
16th to the 20th in Denver. It's going to be incredible. 12,400 people before. We're hoping to have more even now coming up. And so the
Mhm.
road to the future goes through Denver. We were bringing the community together, the ecosystem together for everybody to learn from each other and share data and share strategies and do it in person. I'm doing a lot more interviews now. I'm free to talk now that I'm no longer on the Lycos board. So,
Mhm.
just yesterday I spoke to the New York Times. Today I spoke to the Washington Post. Several days ago I spoke to Stat. I've got other meetings coming up. So it's to recognize that because this is controversial and because psychedelics have been suppressed for so long, we really need to focus on public education. It's not just about the science, it's also about communicating. I think that's where Lycos kind of lost track and they thought it's just about the data. It's not about this other work because they just came from pharma. They just wanted to do traditional approaches and that didn't work. So a lot of public education and the conference. And then the third area is drug policy reform that MAPS is going to do a lot of work on. So the setbacks from FDA that just occurred point to the fact that we need more than ever before drug policy reform. So we need other ways for access to psychedelics because what the FDA just did is going to delay access to MDMA-assisted therapy for 2 years or more. So we need to really explore drug policy reform avenues of how to get access to people. So the first right to try. So Catherine Tucker has been working on this for several years. The federal government passed right to try laws. I think around 35 or 40 states have passed these right to try laws. What that means is that if there's a drug that's being developed through the FDA, but it's not been fully approved, people should have a right to try it at their own risk, at their own expense, negotiating with the pharma company to provide them the drug. And now that the right to try laws make that possible, but the FDA
Mm.
has now added some reporting requirements for right to try. The right to try laws do not allow access to Schedule 1 drugs like MDMA and psilocybin. And there's a lawsuit, I think it's being argued today by Catherine Tucker and her group to try to change that. So that's one way to try to provide access to people for the potential of MDMA.
Nice.
The other is these state initiatives to legalize plant medicines. It began with Denver making mushrooms the lowest enforcement priority. Then other cities took that up. Then eventually we had the Oregon Psilocybin Initiative to make it available in a state with under guides or support. Some can be therapists, some not. It can be people with diagnosis or just wanting personal growth, but it's kind of a supervised access point. Then that was passed in something bigger was passed in Colorado, which went beyond just psilocybin to other plant medicines, including potentially ibogaine and other things. And then there's going to be a initiative on the ballot in November that MAPS has been helping with, also plant medicines to make them available under these guided circumstances for people with diagnosis or not. So we'll see how that does at the November ballot. There was an effort in California to do this through the legislature, and that's where they started trying to add MDMA, but that did not make it through the system. So the problem for us from an MDMA perspective or an LSD perspective is that people have this romantic notion plants are good, synthetics are bad. Plants, if it's a plant medicine. So when you do the polling to see will people vote for natural plant medicines, if you say, will people vote for natural plant medicines and MDMA and synthetics? The answer is no. You knock out MDMA or LSD, then it passes. So,
Right.
so that's going to be difficult, but we're going to try to work on that. Then the Sentencing Commission is a big thing where penalties are set for people who are arrested in possession or distribution or manufacture of Schedule 1 drugs. Right now, it's so skewed that if you get arrested with a pile of MDMA in one hand and the same amount of cocaine in the other hand, you'll go to jail longer for the MDMA. And so these laws were made in 2001, the Sentencing Commission guidelines, and they were done in a way, there were hearings. I testified at these hearings. So did Dave Nichols, so did others. But our testimony was ignored. And so now the science has shifted. It's clear that this neurotoxicity was way overhyped. And so what we're hoping to do is to work with the Sentencing Commission. So that's kind of a large part of the drug policy reform agenda. So MAPS is now down to about 28 people. There were about 40 or so before we just did this recent layoffs in response to the setback at the FDA, which we thought would propel us into, bigger and better support and projects. And I think what we'll be seeing over time is that these efforts will start to bear fruit. I think the global humanitarian projects, we're hoping to do pilot studies and then maybe a year and a half, or at the most like 2 years from now, apply for a $100 million grant over multi-years to really globalize access with local healers and group settings, things like that. I think some of these drug policy reform things will also eventually bear fruit, and then the public education as well. So we're just enthused about the work ahead and are more dedicated than ever. But I would say because of the FDA being slow and blocking things, the work of MAPS is more important than ever.
Wow. I'm so impressed how 28 people were able to do all this work internationally, policy change, educational, even just preparing for psychedelic science alone. The capacity and dedication from MAPS team is super, super impressive and inspiring. I'm hearing a lot of giving people access to psychedelics from all different angles. Sounds like there's some pause for the MDMA part, but also I'm hearing you are very certain that Lagos will be successful. We believe in it. I believe in it because you believe in it. And I am curious, with the new strategy and change of focus looks like, and where's your hope for Lagos will be successful come from? And what does FDA want? Have they tried MDMA? I feel like if they tried, it would be much easier. What do they really want? You said you want to open this to the world. I remember you texting me. It's like, hurry up on your translation so that we can open up China. And I believe that's always the vision. How do we continue the effort on change the decision of FDA, and where's the hope?
Yeah, I think it comes from the reverse of what you're saying. You were saying, has FDA ever done these drugs? If they have done them, they might think differently. Well, I have done these drugs. And I am convinced, not just from my own experience, but I hear stories almost every day from people that found tremendous healing from MDMA or from psilocybin or from 5-MeO-DMT or from other psychedelics. But, mostly people tell me MDMA stories. So I am constantly hearing MDMA healing stories of things that were actually remarkable. So I just heard the other day about a therapy. This was an underground therapy session, just to say, but it was an underground therapy session. And this was husband and wife. And, they're in their 60s, they're old. And then under the influence of MDMA, the wife shared about how she had been sexually abused as a child. And she'd never shared it with anybody. She hadn't been able to talk about it. This is like 40 plus years before. And it really helped their relationship for her to be able to share that. So the optimism comes from not just my experience, not just the stories that I hear, but also from the data that we've gathered. The phase 3 is fundamentally sound. The results are great. So I do believe that Lykos will succeed. And I think FDA would have an extremely difficult time to come to agreement with Lykos and then backtrack off of those agreements. So they've already done that once. We had agreements with FDA about the protocol design, especially about functional unblinding and how we do that. And they proposed therapy with inactive placebo. And they said you need independent raters and random assignment, other ways to look at reducing experimental bias. But I think that it would be, once Lykos and FDA come to agreement on what needs to be done, Lykos, I believe, will be able to execute it. I believe they'll be able to find the funds. And I believe the patients will volunteer. There's 13 million PTSD patients in the US. That's not going to be an issue, finding enough people to volunteer. They're not going to be scared away from what just happened. So I do think that's going to move forward. That's where my optimism comes from, that it's just astonishing, the therapeutic potential, I believe, of MDMA, and we'll be able to show it. As far as, all this work, globalizing and other things, it's been almost 38 and a half years for MAPS. It was wonderful to be with you guys on the 38th anniversary, the full solar eclipse outside of Austin. That was, really wonderful. In your spacesuit that you loaned me. I still
have it, right? We can do that.
So I think that what I wanted to do with that is just to say, 38 and a half years. And now it's a setback, it's another couple of years. And Lykos will be doing that. We'll be doing the other work. It's so worth it to continue to struggle. And we'll just try whatever strategies we can and try to educate the public more and try to educate the FDA. But, I guess I'll say that one worry that I have is, again, that the field gets the idea that because the FDA is saying, oh, we don't regulate psychotherapy, this is a problem, we don't understand it, that the field will move away more from, psychedelics with therapy to more psychedelics with psychological support, something that's less than therapy that I think is not going to be best for patients. So that's the big worry.
And really want to thank you for sharing the breadth of the work that MAPS is continuing to do, and you seems enthused, looking forward to do, unencumbered by your board seat at Lycos and what you could share. And also hearing this fear that the psychedelics can get decoupled with therapy and maybe follow a more traditional pharma route. I know through offline conversations, that's been a deep fear of yours, to the level where earlier you said that you viewed it as unethical.
Well, unethical to give MDMA to severe PTSD patients without either psychological support, whatever that might mean, or therapy. Yeah, just to give MDMA to people and think, oh, that's enough, is unethical, I believe, because stuff comes up. And if you're not capable of processing it, you can end up being worse off. So it's not about the drug. It's about how you process. And it also is not just about the drug experience. It's also about the integration. It's also about the preparation. All of that is what contributes to the outcomes. And so in tech, there's this concept I've heard called the MVP, minimum viable product. What's the minimum you can get out there that it'll be useful enough to people that they'll buy it and use it? And so MAPS has been about the maximum viable product in a way. How do we maximize therapeutic outcomes? We have two people in the room, one a therapist, the other doesn't have to be a therapist, but often male, female, but two people. Two people are not twice as good as one, but it provides safety, it provides support, somebody goes to the bathroom. So our approach has been, what is the best that we can do? What is the maximum viable healing potential that we can figure out? And what I'm about is this other idea is that what can we do that's good enough to get FDA approval, to get out there and cheap enough so that more people can get access. So that's kind of a way that in some senses, there's something reasonable about that. What's the lowest cost that we can do to get the most people access, even if not as deep of a healing, but it's good enough to get them over the hump of depression or suicidality or whatever. So that in a way is the tension. And so MAPS has always been about what's the best we can do. But what actually happened is when we started this, when Lycos started the commercialization process and started talking with insurance companies, what they showed is that the value, you base the price of a drug on the value to the individual, to their family, to society. They're paying taxes, they're working, they're not going to emergency room for panic attacks, all this kind of stuff. The value was so high that it could justify substantial amount of money for the drug and good salaries for the two therapists. So that's one of the reasons for doing this. What's the best we can do is that insurance companies would ideally, and looks like they would cover that. So now the question is, how will the companies think about this? They'll probably just think about, what's the minimum that we need to do to start selling? And I would think the other example is esketamine, Spravato, without therapy, but they're approaching $1 billion annual sales. It's considered enormous success in the pharmaceutical industry is that they made esketamine into a medicine without therapy. Yeah. So it works better with therapy, but the pharma company doesn't make money when the therapists get paid. And if you do it with therapy, then you don't need as much ketamine because you're anchoring it and you're doing the psychological integration. So there's a lot of challenges going ahead. And where I thought about the equitable access aspect of it was through the drug policy reform. If we do the best we can in a clinical context and then get insurance companies to pay for this and people just pay the copays, it's still limited in America because there's so many people that don't have insurance. And a lot of times insurance doesn't cover sufficient salaries for the therapists. And a lot of therapists don't accept insurance. And so I thought that the way to do that is not to make the treatment less, but it's to do drug policy reform in a way to have people to access and train people in peer support and what it means, difficult experiences. But then the one sort of aspect of the research that could be also as good potentially and making it less expensive is group therapy. So that's the cutting edge of the research now is going to be group therapy.
I wanted to hear more about that.
So let me just say that one of our fundraisers used to be, no longer works with MAPS, but he was gay. And what he said was that during the 80s, when people were dying right and left from AIDS, before there was the prohibitors, he said they worked out their grief on the dance floor with ecstasy. All right. What they're saying is that MDMA can have therapeutic potential in other contexts than just therapy in this. But that's when you've educated people, they understand what's going on. So I think the group therapy so the first one was at the Portland, Oregon VA. And what that is, now it's going to be 4 cohorts of 6 people. It's 4 therapists for 6 people. And there's 2 main kind of traumas that people have in the military. One is called, combat related trauma or accidents or things like that. The other is military sexual trauma, MST. That's where people are raped by their fellow soldiers or attacked or abused or something like that. So what they've decided to do is to take people that were similarly traumatized and make groups of them. So instead of combining people with military sexual trauma with combat trauma, they're going to take people, here's a group with military sexual trauma, here's a group with combat trauma. And they're going to get 2 MDMA sessions. Each one is going to get, a first one is going to be on an individual basis, and then the second one is going to be in a group. In Israel, they're going to be doing 400 people with group therapy. And they're going to be doing also starting with 6 people in the group, but they're going to have 2 therapists and 2 assistants. And these will be similarly traumatized together in similar kind of circumstances. In England at King's College, they're talking about groups of 3, 2 therapists for groups of 3. So there's going to be a lot of experimentation around now also both in Israel is they get both experiences, 2 experiences, but both in groups. They're going to skip the individual session first. And I think that's also what's going to happen in the King's College, would be groups together. So there's just a lot of experimentation that will be done. And hopefully the Israeli teams will think, well, what does 8 people look like? What does 10 people look like? Do we add more helpers or more therapists, or exactly how to do it? And then what is the format for the group integration work and helping groups kind of support each other in those ways?
I remember us talking about this at Burning Man last year about the question of how to scale psychedelic healing access, right? And of course, what we do at Ceremonia is very much based on group. And in fact, connection with other people is such a huge component of the healing from our perspective, right? Because we don't live on islands or mountaintops. We live in connected worlds. And so being able to first do the inner work and then connect outwards with people helps not only deepen the healing in our experience, but sustaining it over time.
Created by relationship, we get to be healed through a relationship.
Yeah. I just want to say that it's not enough to give somebody a drug. If they've been traumatized because they've lost trust and people have betrayed them, people have hurt them, it really helps to have people that's part of the healing process. Yeah, Chuchu, that's exactly right.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I just want to paint this picture that, I think for the community that is listening to this podcast, you keep saying this FDA adverse ruling is a setback. This is not a nail in the coffin. This is just a setback. And I think it's really valuable to really emphasize that you believe in 1 to 2 years, Lykos will succeed with the FDA.
So not 1 year. I think it's going to be at least 2 years, 2 years or more. I believe that they will succeed.
Yeah. And complementary to that, you have this multi-pronged approach. Really what it feels like is kind of getting back to your roots that you've dedicated 38 years of your life to, the nonprofit work in education and policy reform and research, not just in the United States, but at a global level in Europe and Somalia, like in China, Chuchu's translating the MAPS manual into Chinese. And I think it can be really easy for people to focus in on this one decision and say, it's all over. And I think that the key takeaway as a message that I'm getting here is this is just a setback on the global level. And when we zoom out enough, it's going to, first, Rick Doblin is now unleashed, and we know. So I feel like that is going to have ramifications we're not even aware of just yet. And number 2, state level, municipal level, like at the academic level, there's so much research that's happening. And you mentioned the Psychedelic Science 2025 here. Just a quick anecdote. I heard it casually mentioned as Learning Man because of, 12,000 psychonauts gathering in Denver. And just, so if anybody, has space for it, please come. It's a great time. And just like looking forward to the future for these next few years, what's your message of hope?
Okay. Well, let me start by saying this. My wife and I have 3 kids. They're 29, 28, and 25. When they're little, and this will resonate mainly with, parents, but when your kids are little, it seems like they're going to be with you forever. It's an endless thing that you don't the end of it. They're going to be with you forever. And, time goes really slowly while you're living it. But then they go off to college or they leave the house to do other things. And you look back and you say, where did that time go? So in retrospect, 20 years was like snap of a finger. So when I'm saying to give people hope, think in longer time frames. We had all hoped that this was going to be done. I'm so ready, 38 years plus, and I'm ready for FDA approval. And, I started the first nonprofit before MAPS in 1984 when it was clear FDA was going to, or DEA was going to try to criminalize MDMA. So I've been at it for 40 years. When I first learned about MDMA 42 years ago, when I was 52 years ago, first focused my life on psychedelics when I met Stan Groff in 1972 and all of that. So what this setback is a severe setback. It's going to be the worst for the people that are suffering that needed it. But in the scale of things, it's not going to be that long. And we will be able to do that. I think that a lot has been learned from all of the work and all the research that's been done before. The other about hope is that eventually, sometimes it takes longer than others, the truth of something comes forward. So when I began 1985, MDMA was criminalized on the basis of it's so neurotoxic, one dose is going to cause permanent brain damage and you're going to have functional consequences. And it's terrible and will not even permit research because even one dose is too dangerous. So we've been in worse places before when we didn't have all the evidence of efficacy of all the patients saying. The other thing for people to keep in mind is that the FDA said no, not yet. They didn't say never. They said not yet. We need more research to make this into a medicine. But they're saying we want more research. So all of the research is going to continue. The FDA is not saying we've discovered this drug is so neurotoxic or whatever that we can't permit research. We're shutting it down. So the research, that's another reason for hope, that the research is going to go forward, not just in the US, but around the world. And that's a good reason for hope. And I think the other part is that we have bipartisan support. That's what, in large part, because of the work with the veterans. But one of the things that Lykos and the PR team worked on is they got a letter from 19 senators and 61 members of the House of Representatives to the president and to FDA saying, make MDMA available. So the level of political support that we've been able to gather is enormous. The public platforms, I'm talking to Washington Post, to New York Times, to Stat, to on and on, to you guys, others. But I guess I want to add one last thing, which is if you believe that something's valuable and that, in a way we're talking about mass consciousness change. We need humanities going over a cliff or like lemmings going over a cliff or, destroying the environment. If you believe that this sort of consciousness change is really important, it's something to recognize that psychedelics have been used for thousands of years. And even when they've been massively suppressed, they've never been able to be eliminated. There's something about psychedelics and human beings where some fraction of human beings will seek them out and will find benefits. So I'd say take hope that we're not the first to discover psychedelics. They've been around for thousands and thousands of years and they're going to continue. And it's just how do we negotiate how they're handled with the mainstream culture. And support is critical, not to be taken for granted that we've been able to do that. And that's what. So that means, I think, that regardless of how the presidential election turns out, that Lykos will succeed.
Wonderful. How I work with medicine with people, and a lot of I adapt from, the Eastern philosophy, the Taoism. The way knows the way. And I don't even personally view this as a setback because it is what it is. Everything else is expectation. We felt disappointed because we expected something different. But this is just also a part of the process. And of course, if we can look at it that way, we just have more patience and more trust and do what we're supposed to do and get the work done and continue be resilient and dedicated to our commitment to consciousness, to the medicine. And thank you for what you shared to encourage all of us who felt a little disheartened and to be hopeful and have more trust. And with that being said, at this critical time, how can us, no matter the passionate psychonauts or communities, how can we best support you, best support MAPS' work during this critical time, because I
Yeah.
really believe you guys need
Wow. Thank you for that.
as well.
Yeah.
And best support each other.
So I think number one is for
Yes.
people to get educated themselves. So the way that you support is that you get educated. So if you have any questions, oh, what did the FDA say about this or that? Or just what about this new thing, 5-MeO DMT? Or what about this or that? So I'd say the most important thing is educate yourself. The second thing that for many, many years, MAPS has, because we've been needing to raise all sorts of money for research, we've sort of moved to a major donor strategy. And the MAPS membership has stayed in the neighborhood of 3,000 or 4,000 people who make donations every year. But it could easily be much larger. And now that we're talking about drug policy reform, where numbers more matter, numbers equal voters, so people could help us by becoming members of MAPS. That would be really helpful. The other part is that come to the Psychedelic Science Conference. And the other part, and this is something that I think is probably the most important thing, is speak to people that you know that may have fears and anxieties. Once you've educated yourself, speak to your parents, speak to your relatives, speak to people. So some of the polling that was done on why people vote for marijuana legalization, one of the most important factors was they know a medical marijuana patient, which is different than marijuana legalization. But if you know somebody that you trust and they tell you that something helped them, then you start questioning, why is this illegal? What about all the other stuff? This doesn't cost any money. People in their own networks of families and friends and distant relatives and all, if you can seek out people that you think are open-minded to listen to the potential value of psychedelic, because again, what just happened at FDA had a lot to do with the public perceptions going negative. I think the more that we can individually share with others what our beliefs are and just at least help them to, it's like the coming out. What helped gay rights, gay marriage was people coming out. We need a grand coming out of psychedelic people. It'd be shocking if everybody who did psychedelics could stand up and people could see who they are. They're throughout all levels of society. People would be shocked. We can all do without any money is sort of stand up in your own communities. There's a lot that each of us can do.
Well, do.
Well, thank you so much, Rick, for being on this episode of Modern Enlightenment with us. Thank you for your continued support of Ceremonia, for your advocacy of psychedelics in general, not just MDMA, for your global humanitarian work. And thank you for
the positivity.
Yeah. And also thank you for not sugarcoating this, even sugarcoating your couple days of depression and then coming back into the swing. And I'm excited to check in. I think I speak for Chuchu and me, excited to check in with you every few months on our regular calls. And
be on the panel at Burning Man.
And see you at Burning Man. Yes.
Yay.
Okay.
This was,
give you a big hug.
Thank you again so much. For those that want to find out more about MAPS, find out more about you, where's the best place to
maps.org. Look at maps.org. And if you look at my bio, there's links there to my dissertation and to some of the the long-term follow-up studies that I've done to Timothy Leary's and Walter Pankey's Good Friday experiment. I did a 25-year follow-up to that, a 36-year follow-up to the Concord Prison experiment. So all of these are available links on my bio on the MAPS website. I think that's the best way. Also, there is a book that's really been written about MAPS's work, focusing on Michael Midhofer, myself, Nick Blackston, one of the veterans we treated, and myself. It's called Acid Test, LSD, Ecstasy, and the Power to Heal. And that's a really wonderful book. The other thing I'll mention is a documentary called Trip of Compassion. And it's about 3 of our Israeli patients with PTSD, but it's the most patient-centered documentary ever made about the process of MDMA-assisted therapy. So I would encourage people to take a look at that. And then I'll just mention, because it's elegant, there's this great documentary called Descending the Mountain, and about the coming together of Zen Buddhism and psychedelics and science and brain science. Yeah, Descending the Mountain. It's poetry. It's a beautiful, beautiful movie about, in Switzerland, lifelong Zen meditators. They go to the University of Zurich for brain scans. Then they go to a Zendo meditation center. I think it was a 5 or 6 day retreat. And in the middle of it, they get a pill, either psilocybin or placebo. They're supposed to meditate through it, which does not exactly work for a lot of them. Then they go back for brain scans, long follow-ups. And what's exciting about it is that it is really the coming together of spirituality and psychedelics. Zen has been traditionally dismissing psychedelics as intoxication. It's not either or, it's how do you synergize. And so that's what Descending the Mountain. So there's a lot of ways. The other thing I might as well mention is episode 3 of How to Change Your Mind, the Netflix documentary with Michael Pollan. The episode 3 was about MDMA, and that's a good one as well.
Yeah,
Excellent.
thank you. I just want to touch upon, because you mentioned the Zen and psychedelics, that's how we facilitate at ceremony, the bringing the mindfulness with psychedelics. And there's research shows that it increased much possibility for people to have actual spiritual experience with psychedelics. And that's also shown in our
that's great. It's like
experience at
these
ceremony.
combinations of things. It's not one way is not the best way. And in fact, maybe the good way to end this, which is that you don't even hyperventilation. You can hyperventilate and get into a psychedelic state. You don't even need drugs. That these are real experiences within us. So the fact that you can use hyperventilation, or you can fasting, or you can use meditation, or you can use different things, these experiences are not contained in the pill. They're contained in us, and they're released by these pills, and they're released in dreams and other ways, and Zen and different ways. So hopefully we will come to a more eclectic kind of situation where people say, this is right for me now. Later, I want this instead. And different people do different things. But I think it's about really this multiplicity of catalysts and the responsibility that we have as humans in this particular time of humanity is to really up our game and to think of ourselves collectively. We see what's happening with global warming. We see what's happening with nuclear weapons. We see what's happening with all sorts of concerns. And we need to figure out how to think as a collective, as humanity as a whole, instead of as my individual race, religion, nationality, socioeconomic status. And I think psychedelics and other things can help us that. So it's a glorious kind of evolution of consciousness that we're part of. And that's why when you think of in the big picture, a little setback of a couple of years, well, we'll just keep working.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Rick, for joining us. Great. This has been a lovely conversation. Excited to see you soon in the dust.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Modern Enlightenment. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to check out our website, subscribe to our online community, and check out our social media links in the show notes for more resources and updates.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to stay connected with our upcoming episodes, where we continue to explore the intersection of modern science and spiritual wisdom. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep shining your light.